For years, my husband treated me like someone who could never survive without him. The moment he demanded a separation in front of my entire family, he smirked and told me I would be begging to come back. I did not argue. I simply picked up my pen and signed the divorce papers right then and there. His confidence vanished instantly. Then his phone rang. After hearing just a few words from the person on the other end, he stared at me in absolute panic. My name is Naomi, and I am 32 years old. Before I tell you how a supposed college dropout brought an entire fake empire to its knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to prove your worth to a family that constantly underestimated you. Growing up in Atlanta, my parents, Vivian and Harrison, cared about one thing above all else, which was our social standing. They worshipped at the altar of high society and expected my younger sister Chloe and me to do the same. Chloe played the game perfectly, while I was always the family embarrassment, the college dropout who ruined their perfect picture. Tonight was supposed to be my 5th wedding anniversary dinner at Aria, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Buckhead. The private dining room was bathed in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, and the table was set with fine china and imported champagne. My husband Marcus sat beside me, projecting the image of a highly successful real estate investor. Across the table sat my parents, hanging onto his every word. Next to them was Chloe, glowing in a designer dress paid for by her husband Julian. Julian was a wealthy white man from a prominent legacy family, and he never missed a chance to remind us of his pedigree. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey, and looking at me with that familiar, condescending smirk. The air in the room felt heavy with the usual toxic expectations, but I simply focused on the rim of my water glass. I had spent years enduring their subtle digs and outright insults. When I left college to pursue my own ventures, my parents had practically disowned me, citing the shame I brought to their elite social circle. They only tolerated my presence because Marcus provided a respectable facade for their eldest daughter. They loved to parade him around as their successful son-in-law, completely ignoring the fact that my independent choices were the only thing that kept me sane. To them, a woman's worth was measured strictly by the man standing next to her and the zip code she lived in. I sat quietly listening to Marcus boast about his latest multi-million-dollar development project while my father nodded along eagerly. The waiter cleared our main courses, and Marcus stood up, tapping his silver fork against his crystal champagne flute. The gentle chiming sound brought the room to a halt. My mother beamed, clasping her hands together in anticipation of a grand romantic speech. Chloe rolled her eyes, but feigned a polite smile. I looked up at the man I had married, expecting the usual performative toast about our wonderful life together. Instead, Marcus reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He did not raise his glass. He did not look at me with love. He threw the heavy stack of papers directly onto my empty porcelain plate with a loud thud. The bold letters on the front page read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." I stared at the papers and then up at his face. Marcus was not smiling warmly. He was looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "I think 5 years of carrying dead weight is enough for any man," he announced, his voice carrying across the quiet private room. My mother gasped, but she did not reach out to comfort me. She looked at Marcus with wide eyes, waiting for an explanation. "You married me just for the credit card, Naomi." Marcus continued, leaning over the table so his face was inches from mine. "You contribute nothing to this household. Without my money and my status, a college dropout like you would be cleaning motel rooms in the slums of this city. You drag down my public image, and I am done pretending you are on my level." A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by a sharp laugh from my sister. Chloe took a sip of her champagne and shrugged. "Well, it was bound to happen eventually," she said smoothly. "You cannot force a square peg into a round hole. Naomi never belonged in this circle anyway. She always lacked the refinement needed to stand beside a man of your caliber, Marcus." My father Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive tie. Now, Marcus, let us not be hasty, but if you feel she is hindering your business growth, we understand you have to protect your assets. My own parents were siding with the man who had just humiliated their daughter in a public restaurant. They were so desperate to maintain their ties to his supposed wealth that they were willing to watch me be discarded like trash. Then Julian chimed in, his tone dripping with that quiet, insidious racism he often used under the guise of casual conversation. "It is just the reality of the world," Marcus, Julian said, swirling the ice in his glass. "When uneducated black women try to jump into a social class they do not understand, they inevitably drown. She should have learned her place a long time ago. You cannot buy class, and you certainly cannot teach it to a dropout. It is better you cut your losses now before she drains your bank accounts completely." I looked at the faces around the table. The people who were supposed to be my family were nodding in agreement with a man who had just insulted my race, my intelligence, and my worth. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at me like a conqueror. "Sign the papers, Naomi," he demanded. "Walk away quietly without asking for a dime of my money, and I will be generous enough to pay off whatever pathetic credit card debt you have racked up this month. Do not try to fight me on this, or I will make sure you leave with absolutely nothing." They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for another chance or throw a hysterical fit right there in the restaurant. They had spent my entire life convincing me that I was weak and dependent. But I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, sharp clarity. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my favorite gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. The metallic click of the cap being removed echoed sharply in the quiet room. I smoothed out the final page of the divorce petition, found the signature line, and signed my name with fluid, graceful strokes. I pushed the papers back across the table toward him. Marcus looked stunned for a fraction of a second before his smug expression returned. He clearly thought my quick surrender was a sign of total defeat. "You always were easy to push around?" he sneered, picking up the documents. "Good girl. Now get your things out of my penthouse by tomorrow morning." I capped my pen and placed it back in my bag, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. The silence in the room was heavy with their shared victory. They thought they had finally put me in my place. But they did not know that the penthouse did not belong to Marcus. They did not know about the shell companies or the hidden accounts. And they certainly did not know that I was the ghost founder of Apex Capital, the private equity firm that practically owned half the city. Right at that moment, Marcus' phone began to vibrate violently on the marble table. The caller ID flashed the name of his lead financial attorney. Marcus picked it up, maintaining his arrogant posture, and put it on speakerphone, intending to show off his busy, important life to my parents. "Marcus, we have a massive problem," the lawyer voice blasted through the speaker, frantic and breathless. "The authorities just froze everything. Your personal accounts, the corporate funds, the offshore trusts. It is all gone. They are outside the office right now, demanding hard drives." Marcus went completely rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. "What are you talking about?" he yelled into the receiver, his polished facade cracking instantly. "That is impossible. I just checked the balances this morning." "It is not impossible," the lawyer shouted back. "Someone leaked the real ledgers. Someone gave them the shadow books, Marcus. They know about the wire fraud. They know about everything." I sat back in my chair, crossing my legs and watching the absolute terror take over his features. The confident, wealthy man who had just thrown me away was crumbling before my eyes. My mother dropped her fork and Julian stopped swirling his drink. The entire table froze in panic. I simply smiled, picking up my glass for another sip. Marcus slammed his furry hand onto the table. The expensive crystal wine glasses rattled dangerously. He yelled into the phone, demanding that his lawyer fix the situation immediately. He screamed that he was a respected developer in Atlanta and that the FBI had no jurisdiction to simply walk into his corporate building and seize his servers. The lawyer sounded as though he was on the verge of a heart attack. He explained that this was not a simple audit. Federal agents had bypassed the lobby and gone straight for the hidden servers in the basement. They had the exact IP addresses. They had the offshore routing numbers. The lawyer yelled that they even had the encrypted passwords for the Cayman Island shell companies. Marcus scrambled to process the information. His perfect tailored suit suddenly looked suffocating. He tugged at his collar, gasping for air. He demanded to know how the authorities could possibly possess that level of classified data. The lawyer told him that an anonymous informant had delivered a physical drive directly to the federal prosecutor. It contained 5 years of pristine, unedited transaction logs, proving Marcus had been laundering money through his luxury real estate developments. The lawyer shouted that he was resigning effectively immediately and advised Marcus to find a criminal defense attorney before hanging up. The dial tone echoed loudly in the private dining room. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father, Harrison, looked at Marcus as if he had just witnessed a murder. My mother, Vivian, clutched her pearl necklace, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. Julian, the man who had just insulted my intelligence moments ago, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly desperate to distance himself from a sinking ship. Chloe stared at Marcus in pure shock. Marcus stared blankly at the dead phone in his hand. He muttered to himself, trying to figure out who could have betrayed him. He looked at Julian with wild, paranoid eyes, accusing Julian of trying to take over his territory. Julian raised his hands defensively, swearing he had nothing to do with this. I set my champagne glass down on the table. The soft clink of the crystal drew every eye in the room back to me. Julian did not do this, Marcus. I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. Marcus turned his furious gaze toward me. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. Keep your mouth shut, Naomi. You do not understand anything about this. This is high-level corporate sabotage. Someone is trying to frame me. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. It is not sabotage, Marcus. It is accountability, and nobody is framing you. The transaction logs on that drive were entirely accurate. I made absolutely sure of it before I mailed the package to the federal prosecutor on Tuesday morning. Marcus froze. The entire table froze. The air in the room felt as though it had been completely sucked out. Marcus let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. He shook his head, refusing to accept reality. You are insane, he scoffed. You barely know how to use the basic accounting software. You are a college dropout. You do not have the clearance or the intelligence to access my encrypted files. I smiled again, allowing the satisfaction of this moment to wash over me. You are right about one thing, Marcus. I did not access your encrypted files. I did not need to. I already had them. When you asked me to organize your home office files 3 years ago, you carelessly left your master administrative drive plugged into your desktop. You assumed I was too uneducated to know what those complex spreadsheets meant. You assumed I was just a naive housewife who would blindly file away your papers without looking at the numbers. But you forgot that numbers are a universal language. I saw the discrepancies immediately. I saw the inflated material costs. I saw the fake vendor payments. I spent the last 3 years quietly copying every single digital ledger you ever created. Every time you went to sleep thinking you had successfully manipulated another investor, I was in the office meticulously backing up your fraud. Marcus' face contorted in a mix of horror and rage. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. You malicious, manipulative witch, he hissed, his voice shaking with venom. You have destroyed my life. You have ruined everything I built. You ruined it yourself, Marcus, I replied smoothly. I simply provided the documentation. But do not worry. You told me to walk away quietly without a dime of your money. I am honoring your request. Since the federal government has now frozen every single asset attached to your name, you actually do not have a dime to give me anyway. You are entirely bankrupt. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. My father looked at me with an expression of sheer horror, as if he did not recognize his own daughter. My mother was trembling uncontrollably, muttering about the scandal and the social ruin this would bring to our family name. Julian, however, looked at me with a new expression. The condescension was gone, replaced by a wary, calculating look. Marcus tried to rally his remaining pride. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain his position of power. You think you are so smart, Naomi, he sneered. You think you have won, but you have just shot yourself in the foot. You have completely destroyed your own lifestyle. How do you plan to survive now? You have no degree. You have no job. You have nothing. I gave you the very credit card you use to buy your clothes and feed yourself. The platinum card in your purse is in my name. When they freeze my accounts, your card gets declined. You will be out on the street begging for spare change by tomorrow afternoon. I let out a genuine soft laugh. The sound of my laughter seemed to enrage him further. I unclasped my designer clutch and pulled out the sleek, heavy platinum credit card he was referring to. I tossed it onto the table between us. It landed next to the signed divorce papers. You really should pay closer attention to your own finances, Marcus, I said, leaning back in my chair. You always bragged about giving me an unlimited supplementary card from your corporate account. You loved telling my parents how generous you were for allowing me to sponge off your hard-earned wealth. But if you had ever actually looked at the billing statements, you would have noticed something very interesting. That card is not linked to your real estate firm. It is linked to Apex Capital. Marcus frowned, his eyes darting down to the metal card on the table. Apex Capital was the massive private equity firm that had been quietly buying up commercial real estate across the entire state of Georgia. They were the invisible giant in the industry. Everyone knew the name, but no one knew who actually ran the company. I do not know what kind of game you are playing, Naomi Marcus said, his voice faltering. I am the one who pays that bill every month. No, Marcus, I corrected him gently. You pay the balance of your own personal expenses. But the corporate account funding that specific platinum card belongs to the founder of Apex Capital. I set up that account 4 years ago. I am the founder of Apex Capital. I am the CEO. I am the primary shareholder. The room fell into a deathly silence. My father's jaw literally dropped. Julian stared at me, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to mask his absolute shock. I continued, letting the truth dismantle the last of Marcus' fragile ego. You thought you were so generous letting me use your money. But the reality, Marcus, is that you have been using my money for years. The seed capital you used to fund your last 2 luxury developments came from a blind trust. You thought you had secured a brilliant deal with an anonymous angel investor. That angel investor was me. I funded your projects because I wanted to see if you could actually succeed legally. But you could not help yourself. You immediately started funneling my clean money into your offshore accounts. You stole from Apex Capital. You stole from me. Marcus sank slowly into his chair, his legs giving out beneath him. He stared at the metal credit card on the table as if it were a venomous snake. The man who had entered the restaurant feeling like a king was now sitting there completely broken, exposed as a fraud and a thief. He had demanded a divorce to rid himself of a dependent wife. Instead, he had just divorced the only person who could have possibly saved him from total ruin. I looked at my family, expecting them to finally see my worth. I expected them to realize that I was not the embarrassment they had always claimed I was. I had built a massive financial empire entirely on my own in the shadows, while they worshipped a man who was nothing more than a criminal. But I had fundamentally misunderstood the depth of their toxic loyalty to social status. My mother, Vivian, suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face was flushed dark red, and her eyes were blazing with a manic, terrifying fury. She did not look at Marcus, the man who had committed federal crimes and lied to her face. She looked directly at me. "You vindictive, ungrateful monster!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. Before I could even register her words or brace myself, my mother lunged across the small space separating our chairs. She raised her hand and struck me across the face with all the strength she possessed. The slap was a violent, deafening crack that echoed through the entire room. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the impact. A sharp, stinging pain exploded across my left cheek, and the metallic taste of blood instantly filled my mouth where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip. I sat perfectly still, my face turned away, my cheek burning with the undeniable physical proof of her ultimate betrayal. The metallic taste of blood pooled in the corner of my mouth. I slowly turned my head back to the center of the table. My mother stood over me, her chest heaving heavily, her hand still trembling from the sheer force of the strike. The entire room was paralyzed. Even Julian, who had spent the last hour mocking me, looked genuinely shocked by the sudden physical violence. I did not raise my hand to my stinging cheek. I did not flinch or cower. I simply reached for my stark white linen napkin and elegantly dabbed the corner of my mouth, coming away with a bright streak of crimson. "You are a disgrace to the Jackson name!" Vivian shrieked, her voice entirely devoid of the polished Southern charm she usually projected to the world. "How dare you destroy your husband? How dare you bring the federal government into our lives? Do you have any idea what you have done to our reputation? The country club will be swarming with rumors by tomorrow morning. You have made us a complete laughingstock." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, completely unsurprised that her primary concern was country club gossip, while her golden son-in-law was facing decades in federal prison. Harrison stepped forward, his face a mask of absolute fury. He slammed his fist onto the table, causing the expensive silverware to rattle against the china. "You have always been a poison to this family, Naomi. Always so bitter. Always so jealous of your sister and the men who actually know how to build real wealth. You think turning Marcus in makes you powerful. It makes you a traitor. We brought you into this elite world and you just burned it to the ground because you could not handle playing your part." I let his ridiculous words wash over me. Playing my part meant staying silent while Marcus stole from my company. It meant smiling for family photos while they constantly ridiculed my intelligence and worth. "You are dead to us," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive growl. "I want you out of our sight. You will leave this restaurant tonight and you will pack your pathetic belongings. I want you out of that Buckhead mansion by midnight. You do not deserve to sleep under a roof paid for by the Jackson family connections. Marcus bought that estate with our blessing and our social backing. You will not spend another second pretending it belongs to you. Turn over the keys right now." Chloe chimed in, nodding vigorously as she recovered from her initial shock. "Yes, give Dad the keys, Naomi. You are probably going to try and steal the artwork or the expensive silver before you get kicked to the curb. We need to secure the property immediately. Julian and I will go over there tonight to make sure Marcus' belongings are entirely safe from your greedy hands." I slowly lowered the blood-stained napkin to the table. The sheer audacity of their demands was almost comical. They were still clinging desperately to the illusion of control, still believing that I was the helpless outcast they could order around at will. I reached into my designer clutch, and my fingers brushed against the heavy, solid brass keys to the estate. I pulled them out, holding them up so they caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. "You want the keys to the Buckhead estate?" I asked, my voice completely steady and ice-cold. "Hand them over right now," Harrison demanded, extending his open palm toward me. "You have no right to that property anymore. You are nothing but a petty, vindictive woman who just ruined her only chance at a good life." I did not hand the keys to him. Instead, I dropped them squarely onto the center of the marble table. They landed with a heavy metallic clatter that silenced the room once again. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Harrison," I said, leaning forward slightly and looking him dead in the eye. "I will not be sleeping at the Buckhead mansion tonight, but neither will Marcus, and neither will any of you." My father frowned, his hand hovering uncertainly over the brass keys. "What kind of nonsense are you talking about now? Stop playing games and get out of here." I turned my piercing gaze to Marcus, who was still slumped in his chair, hyperventilating and staring blankly at the wall. "Tell them, Marcus. Tell your loyal defenders what happened to your precious mansion last month. Tell them about the brightly colored notices you desperately hid in your bottom desk drawer." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head weakly, but he absolutely refused to speak. "Since my soon-to-be ex-husband is suddenly at a loss for words, I will gladly fill you in," I said, turning my attention back to my parents. "Marcus has not paid the mortgage on that grand estate in 8 months. He leveraged the house to the absolute maximum limit, trying to cover up the massive financial losses from his fraudulent investments. He took out secret loans against the equity. When those funds dried up, he simply stopped paying the bank altogether. The property went into deep foreclosure 30 days ago." Vivian let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Foreclosure. That is entirely impossible. We are hosting the annual Winter Charity Gala there next week. The gold-embossed invitations have already been mailed to the governor. Not anymore, you are not, I replied smoothly. The bank seized the property. But the story gets even better, Vivian. When a massive property like that hits the distressed asset market, it gets scooped up very quickly by private equity firms looking for a massive bargain. Apex Capital purchased the debt and the deed 2 weeks ago in cash. My company owns that mansion now. Chloe's face turned chalk white. Julian shifted very uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting nervously between me and the keys resting on the table. As the CEO of Apex Capital, I executed a formal eviction notice this morning. I continued keeping my tone completely businesslike and devoid of any emotion. I already had my personal belongings moved to my actual residence days ago. The locks on the Buckhead estate were changed at exactly 8:00 tonight, while we were sitting here eating our expensive appetizers. Marcus' key no longer works. Your spare keys no longer work. The private security team stationed at the iron gates has strict federal orders to arrest anyone who attempts to enter the property for criminal trespassing. I looked directly at my mother, whose face was crumbling under the crushing weight of sheer social devastation. So if you were planning to go over there tonight to secure his expensive suits or prepare for your precious winter gala, I highly recommend you bring a very warm coat. It gets quite chilly standing on the sidewalk, waiting for the police to arrive. I sincerely wish you all a very fun night sleeping outside. The harsh reality of the situation crashed down on them like a concrete wall. The golden son-in-law was a completely broke federal criminal facing decades behind bars. The grand mansion they used to show off their wealth and status was completely gone. And the daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like absolute garbage was the ruthless billionaire holding the deed to their entire social existence. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of Marcus' ragged breathing and the faint classical music playing through the restaurant speakers. Vivian sank slowly into her chair, looking physically ill. Her perfect world had just evaporated. Chloe grabbed Julian by the arm, her manicured nails digging deep into his expensive suit jacket, as she realized her social standing was tied to this massive scandal. Then Harrison's face contorted into something ugly, desperate, and wild. He realized that his traditional methods of intimidation were completely useless against the immense power I now held. He could not threaten me with eviction or social ruin because I owned the very board they were all trying to play on. So he dug into the darkest, most painful corner of our family history, seeking the one weapon he thought could still draw my blood. He stepped toward me, his eyes wide and unhinged. A vicious sneer spread across his face, revealing the true depth of his cruelty. "You think you are a god now, Naomi?" he roared, his voice vibrating with a desperate, pathetic need to tear me down. "You think hiding behind your little corporate titles makes you untouchable? You think you have won because you bought a foreclosed house and called the authorities?" I remained perfectly still, watching him unravel before my eyes. "You are absolutely nothing!" Harrison spat, his face turning purple. "You are exactly what you have always been, which is an unwanted mistake. You think you are so rich now, but you are forgetting something very important. You are forgetting your place in this family. Did you really think we would ever let a failure like you keep real money?" I narrowed my eyes slightly, analyzing his sudden shift in tactics. "What are you talking about?" Harrison let out a loud, barking laugh that sounded more like a cornered animal than a proud patriarch. "Your precious grandmother. Your sweet, beloved grandmother, who actually thought you had potential. Do you remember the trust fund she set up for you before she died? The $500,000 she explicitly left in your name to start your life and build your future." A cold, heavy knot formed instantly in my stomach. My grandmother was the only person in the Jackson family who had ever shown me genuine, unconditional love. When she passed away, she left me a substantial trust to ensure I could always stand on my own 2 feet. It was the money I had originally planned to use to start my software company, but when I went to claim it years ago, I was told the funds were tied up in complex, endless probate issues. I had been forced to start my business from absolute scratch, working 3 grueling jobs to fund my own coding projects. "What about her money?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously low register. Harrison smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. He pointed across the table at Julian, who suddenly looked extremely nervous and refused to make eye contact with me. "You never saw a single penny of that money, Naomi. And you never will. You think you are a genius for hiding your little company. Well, we hid something much bigger. That $500,000 never stayed in probate. I used my legal power as the family executor to authorize a permanent transfer." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and bitter hatred. "I transferred your entire inheritance into Julian private investment accounts 4 years ago. Your grandmother money went directly into Julian pocket to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle. You have been funding their designer clothes and their European vacations this entire time. So go ahead and gloat about your foreclosed house. You will never get that inheritance back." The stinging heat of my mother's hand across my face lingered long after I walked out of that restaurant. My father's desperate threats had echoed through the crisp night air as he screamed that my grandmother's $500,000 inheritance was safely tucked away in Julian's pockets. They thought that revelation would finally break me. They thought knowing my own family had stolen my future to fund their golden child would force me to my knees. But they fundamentally misunderstood the woman I had become. I did not go home to cry. I did not mourn the loss of a family that had never truly loved me. The very next morning, I dressed in a sharp-tailored suit and drove straight to the sleek downtown headquarters of Bradley and Jackson Innovations. The corporate office was a monument to unearned arrogance. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, showcasing a city they believed they conquered. The receptionist, a young woman who had clearly been hired for her appearance rather than her competence, tried to stand up and block my path. I did not even break my stride. I walked right past her polished desk, ignoring her frantic protests, and pushed open the heavy oak double doors to the executive corner office. Julian was sitting directly in the center of the room, occupying the massive leather chairman's chair. His expensive Italian leather shoes were propped carelessly on top of the immaculate mahogany desk. He held a cup of artisan coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. Chloe was perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, scrolling through social media with an expression of supreme boredom. When the door slammed against the walls, Julian barely flinched. He slowly lowered his phone and let out a loud, mocking chuckle. He looked me up and down, taking in my presence as if I were a stray dog that had somehow wandered into his pristine sanctuary. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence." Julian drawled, a nasty smirk spreading across his face. "I assume you are here because Marcus finally kicked you to the curb. Did you come to beg for a receptionist job, Naomi? I might be able to find a spot for you in the mailroom if you promise to keep your head down and stay out of sight." I stepped fully into the office and let the heavy doors click shut behind me, sealing us inside. I stood tall, refusing to shrink under his condescending gaze. "I did not come for a job, Julian. I came because Harrison was very generous with his information last night. He told me exactly how you managed to secure the startup capital for this little vanity project of yours." Julian burst into genuine laughter, removing his feet from the desk and leaning forward. He folded his hands together, resting them on the polished wood. He did not look ashamed. He did not look guilty. He looked incredibly proud of himself. "Your father practically handed me that trust fund on a silver platter," Julian said, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "You have to understand, Naomi, your parents are desperate. They are absolutely obsessed with the validation that comes from being associated with a wealthy white man from a legacy family. When I told Harrison I needed $500,000 to legitimize this tech startup, he scrambled to rewrite the executor documents faster than I could even ask. He wanted to buy my presence in this family, and your grandmother's money was the perfect currency." He stood up from the chairman's chair, pacing slowly around the desk, like a predator showing off his territory. He looked at me with intense, unmasked disgust. "Let us be entirely honest about how the real world operates, Naomi. A black woman with no college degree and no social refinement has absolutely no business holding on to $500,000. What were you going to do with it?" Start a hair salon. Open a boutique. It is a known biological fact that women like you do not understand how to handle massive capital. You would have blown through that entire inheritance in a year, trying to pretend you were something you are not. Julian leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He wore his prejudice like a badge of honor, completely unbothered by his own cruelty. I actually did your family a massive favor by taking control of those assets. When I walk into a bank in this city, they see my face, they hear my last name, and they instantly hand over lines of credit. My white privilege is the only reason this company even got off the ground. My heritage gave Bradley and Jackson Innovations the sheer legitimacy it needed to attract major investors. You should be thanking me on your knees for keeping your family name relevant. Chloe set her phone aside and stood up, walking over to stand proudly beside her husband. She slipped her arm through his, looking at me with the exact same disdain my mother had shown the night before. Julian is entirely right, Naomi, Chloe said, her voice sickly sweet and utterly poisonous. You are being completely overdramatic about a trust fund you never even knew how to use. You were always way too ambitious for your own good. You always thought you were destined for greatness, but you needed a severe reality check. You were never going to succeed. Chloe crossed her arms, her manicured nails digging slightly into her own sleeves. She smiled a wicked, highly satisfied smile as she prepared to deliver a blow she had clearly been holding onto for years. Do you remember the prestigious design academy you applied to when you were 18? Chloe asked, her eyes gleaming with malice. You waited by the mailbox for months, checking every single afternoon for an acceptance letter that you thought never arrived. You cried for a week when you assumed they rejected you. And because you thought you failed, you were forced to take that grueling minimum wage job to help support the family while I went off to my private university. A cold, sickening realization began to settle over me, but I kept my face entirely blank. The acceptance letter actually did arrive, Naomi. Chloe confessed, her tone completely devoid of any remorse. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. A big, thick envelope with a gold seal on the front. I found it sitting right there on the kitchen counter. I read the congratulations on the very first page, and I realized that if you went off to a fancy art school in another state, my parents would be spending their extra money on your tuition. I immediately shredded the entire envelope into tiny little pieces and threw it in the trash compactor before you ever got home from school. Chloe looked me right in the eye, boldly claiming ownership of my destroyed dreams. I destroyed your future because I needed you to stay right here in Atlanta. I needed you to work double shifts so you could hand over your paychecks to the family. I needed that extra money to fund my sorority dues and my designer wardrobe. Your silly little dreams were completely irrelevant compared to my comfort. You were always meant to be the stepping stone for my success. They stood there together, the golden child and the legacy husband, waiting eagerly for me to shatter into a million pieces. They waited for the tears to stream down my face. They waited for me to scream and throw a hysterical fit about how incredibly unfair life was. They desperately wanted me to break down and demand my grandmother's money back so they could enjoy the sheer pleasure of denying me once again. They wanted to watch me beg for the life they had stolen. Instead, I felt a warm, genuine sensation bubble up from deep within my chest. I tilted my head back and I laughed. It was not a forced chuckle or a hysterical giggle. It was a rich, melodic, and entirely terrifying laugh that echoed loudly against the expensive glass walls of their pristine office. Julian dropped his smug smile instantly, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Chloe took a slight step back, physically unnerved by my reaction. The energy in the room shifted violently as they realized I was not playing the victim role they had so carefully scripted for me. You think I came here to beg for my money back? I asked, my laughter fading into a cold, dead stare that locked them perfectly in place. You think I care about a meager $500,000 handout from a startup that barely breaks even? Julian stood up straight, dropping his arms to his sides. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. I did not answer him with words. I took a slow, deliberate step toward his desk. I reached down and grabbed the solid brass handles of my sleek, custom leather briefcase. I lifted it smoothly and placed it squarely on the center of Julian's immaculate desk, pushing aside his expensive coffee cup. The heavy metallic click of the twin locks popping open echoed in the silent room like the sound of a gun being cocked. Julian stared at the leather briefcase. The metallic echo of the locks popping open seemed to break his trance. He slammed his hand down on his desk intercom button. "Security! I need security in the chairman office immediately. We have a hostile trespasser." He released the button and glared at me with absolute contempt. "You have exactly 60 seconds before 2 armed guards physically drag you out of my building by your hair." I did not blink. I slowly lifted the lid of the briefcase and reached inside. I pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bound in thick black leather folders. I dropped them onto his desk with a heavy thud. Julian rolled his eyes, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms over his chest. "Let me guess. You brought a lawsuit. You went to some bargain basement lawyer and drafted a pathetic civil suit trying to claim your grandmother $500,000. Save your breath, Naomi." Harrison covered his tracks perfectly. "By the time my legal team finishes burying you in discovery motions, you will owe me money for wasting my time. You cannot touch that trust fund." I rested my fingertips on the cool leather of the top folder. "You really think I care about $500,000, Julian? I generate that amount of revenue before I finish my morning coffee. You can keep my grandmother money. Consider it a charitable donation to a failing entrepreneur. I did not come here to collect a measly $500,000. Julian frowned, his arrogant facade slipping just a fraction. "Then what is this?" "This is the reality check Chloe said I needed," I replied, sliding the heavy folder across the polished mahogany. It stopped right at the edge of his desk, perfectly aligned with his hands. "Go ahead, Julian. Read the front page. After all, a brilliant tech CEO like yourself should always be up to date on his own corporate filings." Julian hesitated. He glanced at Chloe, who was watching me with narrow, suspicious eyes. Slowly, he reached out and flipped open the black cover. His eyes scanned the top of the document. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the bold black letters printed across the header. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "What is it?" Julie and Chloe asked, her voice laced with sudden anxiety. She stepped closer to the desk, trying to read over his shoulder. "What does it say?" Julian could not speak. His jaw worked silently as he read the first paragraph. His hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy paper shook. "It is a debt acquisition portfolio, Chloe," I said, filling the silence with a calm, steady voice. "Your husband loves to brag about how his heritage and his last name got him automatic lines of credit. He is absolutely right. The banks took one look at his legacy background and handed him millions of dollars to fund this shiny little startup. But the banks also expect a return on their investment. And Julian is a terrible businessman." I began to slowly pace in front of his desk, detailing the exact nature of his failure. Bradley and Jackson Innovations has not generated a single dollar of actual profit in 3 years. Julian spent the loan money on corner offices, luxury company cars, and lavish executive retreats. He burned through his operating capital in 18 months. To keep the lights on, he took out massive commercial loans. He leveraged the company servers, the intellectual property, and every single patent your engineers created. He borrowed against future projections that were never going to happen. He racked up $15 million in toxic unpayable debt. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the signature line at the bottom of the page. "The primary bank was preparing to call the loans 30 days ago," I continued. "They were going to force this company into bankruptcy and liquidate the assets. But a private equity firm stepped in at the final hour. They offered the bank a cash buyout for the toxic debt, purchasing all $15 million for a fraction of the cost. The bank gladly washed their hands of you, Julian. Apex Capital." Julian whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "Apex bought the debt." "That is correct," I said, stopping directly in front of him. "I did not come here to demand my trust fund back. I came here to officially notify you that Apex Capital owns every single liability attached to your name. We own the loans on your servers. We own the loans on your patents. We own the lease on this very building. You do not owe the bank $15 million anymore, Julian. You owe me. Chloe gasped, taking a full step back from the desk. You cannot do this. You cannot just buy our debt. It is perfectly legal and standard corporate practice, I replied smoothly. And because Julian has officially missed his last 3 scheduled loan payments, his accounts are in severe default. Julian suddenly slammed the folder shut and stood up. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, desperately trying to reclaim his authority. You listen to me. I am the chairman of this board. I am the chief executive officer. You cannot just walk in here and threaten me. I will find new investors. I will refinance. You will not take my company. I smiled, leaning over his desk so my face was inches from his. You are not the CEO, Julian. Read Clause 4, Section B of your original loan agreement. The covenants stipulate that in the event of a severe 60-day default, the primary creditor reserves the right to instantly restructure executive management to protect their financial assets. I triggered that clause at 9 o'clock this morning. I tapped the black folder with my manicured fingernail. You have no title. You have no equity. You have no company. You are fired. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors swung open. 2 massive security guards stepped into the office. Their radios crackled softly in the tense silence. Julian immediately pointed at me, his eyes wild with desperation. Thank God. Grab her. Remove this woman from my office immediately. She is trespassing and issuing terroristic threats. The guards stepped forward, but I simply turned to face them. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper stamped with the official corporate seal of Apex Capital, alongside a notarized injunction from the state business court. I handed it to the head of security. Gentlemen, I said, maintaining a tone of absolute calm authority, I am Naomi Jackson, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Capital. We have officially seized all assets of this company as of this morning. The man currently standing behind that desk has just been terminated. He no longer has any authorization to be on the premises. Please escort Mr. Bradley and his wife out of my building immediately. Do not let them touch any computers or file cabinets. The head security guard reviewed the document. He looked at the gold seal. He looked at Julian, and then he looked back at me. He nodded respectfully. He handed the paper back to me and turned toward Julian. Sir, I am going to have to ask you to step away from the desk and come with us. Are you out of your mind? Julian shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. I pay your salary. I hired you. You cannot throw me out of my own office. Actually, my company pays your salary now, I corrected him. And you are currently loitering. The second guard stepped up beside Chloe, gesturing toward the door. Ma, and please gather your purse. We need you to vacate the floor. Chloe completely lost her mind. The reality of losing her wealth, her status, and her husband's powerful position caused her entire pristine facade to shatter into a million jagged pieces. She slapped the security guard hand away and lunged toward me, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. The first guard intercepted her, grabbing her arm and pulling her back before she could reach my face. Get your filthy hands off me! Chloe screamed, thrashing wildly against the guard grip. She kicked at the mahogany desk, her designer heels scuffing the expensive wood. She glared at me with eyes full of poisonous hatred. You think you are so powerful, Naomi? Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the executive hallway. You think destroying your own family makes you a winner. You are nothing but a bitter, miserable hag. You can buy all the debt in the world, but you cannot buy a single person who actually gives a damn about you. I watched her thrash, maintaining my icy composure. Her words were meant to cut deep, but they only sounded like the frantic, pathetic cries of a spoiled child whose toys had just been taken away. Chloe continued to scream, her voice growing increasingly hysterical as the guard began dragging her toward the heavy oak doors. Look at your pathetic life. Marcus threw you away like absolute trash the second he got the chance. Our parents hate the very sight of you. You have no one, You will always be entirely alone. Nobody loves you, Naomi. Nobody will ever protect you. Julian was shoved toward the door right behind her, his face pale and slack with shock. He had completely shut down, unable to process the fact that a black woman he viewed as inferior had just legally and methodically dismantled his entire privileged existence. "Call the police, Julian," Chloe wailed, digging her heels into the carpet to slow the guards down. "Call Dad. We will have her arrested. We will lock her in a psych ward. You hear me, Naomi? You are an unloved, miserable freak." Just as Chloe screamed the final insult, the heavy oak doors swung open wider. The security guards froze. Chloe stopped thrashing. Julian gasped. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on the doorway. Marcus stepped into the executive office. He looked entirely different from the arrogant, perfectly groomed man who had demanded a divorce in the private dining room. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained. His tie was missing, and the top buttons of his shirt were torn open. He had dark, heavy bags under his bloodshot eyes, and he smelled faintly of stale alcohol and pure panic. He looked like a man who had spent the last 48 hours running from a nightmare he could not escape. But it was not his disheveled appearance that caused the entire room to fall into a stunned, breathless silence. It was the person standing right next to him. Clinging tightly to Marcus' right arm was a young, stunningly beautiful blonde white woman. She wore a simple pale pink sundress that clung softly to her figure. Her delicate hands rested protectively over her stomach. Her belly was visibly, undeniably, and heavily swollen with pregnancy. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Julian stared at the doorway, his jaw completely unhinged as he recognized the woman clinging to the disgraced criminal standing before us. He took a stumbling step away from his desk, his eyes darting frantically between the swollen belly and the familiar face. Sarah. Julian choked out his voice, barely a hollow whisper. "What in the world are you doing here? Why are you with him?" Sarah ignored her brother completely. She did not even look at the security guards or the chaotic mess of the executive office. Her pale blue eyes were locked directly on me. She lifted her chin with an unmistakable air of supreme entitlement, a trait clearly bred deep into the bones of her legacy family. She tightened her grip on Marcus' arm and stepped forward, pulling the trembling, exhausted man along with her. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile that masked a deep, predatory cruelty. She gently ran her manicured hand over the pronounced curve of her stomach, making sure every single person in the room understood exactly what they were looking at. "I am here to claim what rightfully belongs to my family," Sarah announced, her voice ringing clear and confident through the tension. Marcus and I did not want to hide anymore. He has spent years chained to a miserable, ungrateful woman who completely failed to appreciate the empire he was building. He needed a partner who actually understood his vision. He needed a real woman who could give him the one thing you were physically and fundamentally incapable of providing, Naomi. She patted her stomach again, her smile widening into a triumphant sneer. "I am carrying Marcus' son. I am carrying the true heir to his legacy. We are going to build a beautiful life together, and no amount of your bitter jealousy is going to stop us." Marcus refused to look at me. He stared at the floor, his face completely drained of color, sweating profusely through his ruined designer collar. He knew the absolute catastrophic reality of his situation, but Sarah was entirely oblivious. She genuinely believed she had just secured her future with a wealthy, powerful Atlanta real estate mogul. She had absolutely no idea that the man standing next to her was completely bankrupt and facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I waited for the eruption. I waited for my parents to turn on Marcus, to scream at him for bringing his pregnant mistress into a corporate office to humiliate their eldest daughter. I waited for my father to defend my honor, or for my mother to slap Marcus the exact same way she had violently slapped me just 12 hours earlier. Instead, I witnessed the most grotesque display of social desperation I had ever seen in my entire life. Vivian gasped, but it was not a gasp of horror. Her eyes lit up with a sudden frantic calculation. She looked at Sarah, taking in her blonde hair, her pristine features, and her direct biological connection to Julian's prominent high society family. In my mother-twisted hierarchy of worth, Marcus' infidelity and federal crimes were entirely irrelevant compared to the sheer social value of a white legacy bloodline. Vivian literally shoved past the security guards and rushed toward the doorway. She did not approach Marcus. She went straight to Sarah, reaching out with trembling, eager hands to grasp the young woman's shoulders. "Oh, you poor dear." Vivian, cooed, her voice instantly softening into a sickeningly maternal tone. "You should not be standing in all this stress. It is not good for the baby. Please come sit down." She shot a vicious, glaring look over her shoulder directly at me. My own mother positioned herself like a human shield between me and my husband's pregnant mistress. "Do not you dare look at her with that jealous attitude." Naomi Vivian spat, her face contorting with disgust. "You brought this entirely on yourself. You have always been a barren, bitter tree. You spent your entire marriage obsessing over your silly little computer codes and your secret bank accounts instead of doing your duty as a wife. You could not give this man a child. You could not give this family a proper heir. What did you expect him to do? Sit around waiting for a miracle while you withered away into nothing?" Harrison stepped up right beside his wife, nodding in absolute solemn agreement. He looked at Sarah Belli with a sense of bizarre pride, completely ignoring the fact that his son-in-law was a monumental fraud. "This is what a real blessing looks like," Naomi Harrison declared, his voice echoing with absolute righteous authority. "Marcus is a man of immense stature. He needs a legacy. He needs a son to inherit his name and his developments. Sarah comes from an impeccable family. The merging of the Blackwood and Jackson lineages through this child is the best thing that could possibly happen to our social standing. You are nothing but a dead branch on this family tree. You should be grateful Marcus found someone to carry the burden you were too defective to bear." Chloe rushed over, joining the circle of delusion. She wiped a dramatic fake tear from her eye and reached out to hold Sarah's hand. "We are going to be such wonderful aunts," Chloe gushed, ignoring the fact that she was currently being evicted from her husband's own company. "This baby is going to have the absolute best of everything." I stood behind the mahogany desk, watching my entire biological family rally around a woman who had helped destroy my marriage. They were openly celebrating my inability to conceive, using my deepest personal pain as a weapon to elevate themselves. They were so blinded by their desperate obsession with class status and proximity to whiteness that they were actively welcoming a mistress into the fold simply because her last name carried historical wealth. They thought this was the final crushing blow. They thought parading a pregnant woman in front of me would finally shatter my iron composure and send me spiraling into an emotional breakdown. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg for my dignity. I looked at Sarah's smug, satisfied face. I looked at my mother's desperate, fawning hands. I looked at Marcus' terrified, sweating brow. I did not feel an ounce of pain. I did not feel a single drop of sorrow for the family I was losing. I felt a cold, sharp, and absolute liberation. I began to smile. It started as a small, subtle curve of my lips, but it quickly grew into a wide, beaming expression of pure, unadulterated amusement. My smile was so sharp, so entirely devoid of any warmth or sorrow, that it caused the temperature in the room to plummet. Vivian stopped coddling Sarah. Harrison frowned deeply, taking a defensive step back. Chloe dropped Sarah's hand, her eyes darting nervously toward the security guards. "What is wrong with you?" Chloe shrieked, her voice trembling. "Why are you smiling like a psychopath? You just lost your husband and your inheritance. You have absolutely nothing." I let out a soft, genuine sigh, stepping around the desk and walking slowly toward the bizarre family portrait gathered by the door. "You are all so beautifully, incredibly tragic," I said, my voice smooth and calm, washing over their frantic panic like ice water. "You are clinging to a burning ship simply because you like the color of the sails. You think this child is going to secure your place in high society. You think Marcus is going to build a beautiful life for this rightful heir." I stopped a few feet away from Sarah. She instinctively clutched her stomach, her arrogant smirk finally faltering under my dead, unwavering gaze. "Sarah," I said, tilting my head slightly, You seem like a very confident woman. You seem absolutely certain that you have won the grand prize. But let me ask you a very simple, very important question. Are you absolutely certain that Marcus is the father of that child? Sarah's face turned scarlet with instant outrage. How dare you! She gasped, stepping back and clutching Marcus' arm even tighter. Of course it is his baby. We have been together for 8 months. He is the only man I have been with. You are just a jealous, pathetic woman trying to ruin my joy. Vivian lunged forward, pointing her finger mere inches from my nose. Stop it, Naomi. Stop trying to poison this blessing with your toxic lies. You are embarrassing yourself. Accept your defeat and leave this family in peace. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my sleek smartphone. I unlocked the screen and tapped a few buttons, navigating to my saved contacts. The room fell dead silent as everyone watched my fingers move across the glass. I hit the dial button and pressed the speaker icon, holding the phone up in the quiet space. It rang once, it rang twice. A cheerful professional woman voice echoed clearly through the speaker, filling the tense executive office. Thank you for calling the Atlanta Men Health and Fertility Clinic, the voice chimed brightly. This is Brenda speaking. How can I direct your call today? Yes, this is Naomi Jackson, I said, keeping my voice loud and perfectly projected so every single person in the room could hear every syllable. I am calling to request a verbal verification of my husband's medical records for our insurance auditor. I have Marcus Jackson right here in the room with me. Could you please confirm the exact date of his last surgical procedure and the final results of his post-operative fertility panel? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he suddenly realized exactly what I was doing. He took a stumbling step forward, his hand reaching out blindly toward my phone, but the 2 massive security guards instantly stepped into his path, blocking him completely. Yes, Mrs. Jackson. I have his file right here on my screen. The cheerful receptionist announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls. Mr. Jackson underwent a bilateral vasectomy exactly 3 years and 2 months ago. I am looking at his most recent follow-up panel from last month, and I can confirm that the procedure was entirely successful. His motility and sperm count are at absolute 0. The doctor noted that the procedure is considered completely irreversible. Can I help you with anything else today? No, Brenda, that will be all, I replied, my voice smooth as silk. You have been incredibly helpful. Have a wonderful afternoon. I tapped the screen and ended the call. The soft click of the disconnecting line sounded like a bomb going off in the dead silence of the executive office. I slowly lowered my phone and slipped it back into my blazer pocket. I turned my gaze away from the phone and looked directly at the stunning blonde woman in the pale pink sundress. Sarah was no longer smiling. Her arrogant, smug expression had literally melted off her face, leaving behind a mask of pure, terrified panic. The color had drained from her cheeks, making her look sickly and pale. She slowly removed her hands from her swollen stomach, as if the child she was carrying had suddenly become a ticking time bomb. Well, Sarah, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy tension like a freshly sharpened blade. Unless you are currently carrying the second coming of a divine miracle, I highly suggest you start explaining exactly whose child is growing inside your stomach. Because it is biologically and medically impossible for that baby to belong to the man standing next to you. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the kind of absolute quiet that precedes a catastrophic natural disaster. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes darting from me to her brother Julian, and finally to Marcus. She took a tiny, trembling step backward, shaking her head in a desperate, pathetic attempt to deny the undeniable reality. "Marcus, it is a mistake," Sarah stammered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "They must have mixed up the files. You know how these clinics are. They are incompetent. You know this is your baby. We planned this. We talked about our future." Marcus did not move. He stood completely paralyzed, staring at Sarah's swollen belly with a look of sheer, unadulterated devastation. His brain was visibly struggling to process the monumental magnitude of his own destruction. He had lost his lucrative real estate empire. He had lost his luxury penthouse. He had lost his brilliant, wealthy wife. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for money laundering and wire fraud. And the only thing, the absolute only thing that had kept him going through the last 48 hours of absolute hell was the belief that he had secured a legacy. He truly believed he had a loyal woman carrying his rightful heir. Now he realized that the woman he had sacrificed his entire life for was nothing more than a calculating, opportunistic gold digger who had gotten pregnant by another man and decided to pin the child on the richest idiot she was sleeping with. "You lied to me," Marcus whispered, his voice a ragged, guttural rasp. "Marcus, please," Sarah begged, reaching out to touch his chest. "I love you." "Do not touch me," Marcus roared, slapping her hands away with such violent force that she stumbled backward into the doorframe. The illusion of high society refinement evaporated instantly. Marcus' face twisted into a mask of pure feral rage. He lunged forward, grabbing Sarah by the collar of her expensive pink sundress and slamming her hard against the heavy oak door. He did not care that she was pregnant. He did not care that there were witnesses. He was a completely broken man who had just lost everything, and he directed every single ounce of his fury at the woman who had played him for a fool. "Whose baby is it?" Marcus screamed, shaking her violently against the wood. "Tell me the truth, you parasitic leech! Whose child have I been paying for? I bought you a condominium. I bought you diamonds. I threw away my entire marriage for you. Who is the father?" Sarah shrieked in terror, covering her face with her arms and sobbing hysterically. Julian, who had been standing frozen behind his desk, suddenly snapped out of his shock. Seeing his precious sister being violently attacked by a disgraced criminal completely shattered his carefully cultivated corporate persona. "Get your hands off my sister, you piece of trash!" Julian bellowed, vaulting over the mahogany desk like a wild animal. Julian crashed into Marcus with his full body weight tackling him away from Sarah. The two men hit the floor with a bone-crunching thud. The pristine executive office instantly transformed into a chaotic, violent brawl. Julian threw a savage punch, catching Marcus directly in the jaw. Marcus retaliated, grappling with Julian and throwing him backward into a glass display cabinet. The cabinet shattered, raining jagged shards of expensive crystal down on top of them. They rolled across the plush carpet, grunting and cursing, exchanging brutal, uncoordinated blows. The artisan coffee Julian had been drinking spilled everywhere, staining the pristine white rug with a dark, muddy puddle. They smashed into the side of the mahogany desk, knocking over files and expensive desk ornaments. It was a pathetic, undignified display of male ego and unchecked rage. The men who had spent their entire lives hiding behind tailored suits and corporate titles were now thrashing on the floor like common street thugs. Chloe was shrieking at the top of her lungs, frantically dialing the police on her cell phone, while jumping back to avoid the flying glass. Sarah was crumpled against the doorframe, wailing uncontrollably and clutching her stomach. Vivian stood frozen in the center of the room, her hands pressed tightly against her mouth. The woman who just moments ago had praised Sarah's pure legacy bloodline and insulted my inability to conceive was now watching her perfect high society dream devolve into a trashy, violent spectacle. She looked physically ill, her eyes wide with horror as she watched the golden son-in-law she had worshipped violently pummeling the legacy family member she so desperately wanted to impress. The two massive security guards finally sprang into action, rushing forward to pry the men apart. It took both guards using maximum physical force to drag Julian and Marcus away from each other. They pinned the men against opposite walls of the office. Julian was bleeding from a cut above his eye, his expensive suit jacket ripped at the seam. Marcus was panting heavily, his lip busted and a dark purple bruise already forming on his cheekbone. I stood calmly beside the desk, watching the entire pathetic scene unfold, with a sense of cold, detached satisfaction. I did not flinch when the glass shattered. I did not raise my voice when the shouting began. I simply watched them destroy themselves. This was the elite world my parents valued over my own life. This was the prestigious social circle they had sacrificed my happiness to protect. It was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on lies, fraud, and massive unearned egos. And all I had to do was pull one single card to watch the entire structure collapse into dust. Harrison was shaking with a rage so profound his entire body vibrated. He looked around the destroyed office, taking in the shattered glass, the bleeding men, the sobbing pregnant mistress, and the absolute ruin of his social standing. He could not process the shame. He could not accept that his entire worldview had been proven fundamentally flawed. Instead of looking at the criminals and the liars who had actually caused this disaster, he turned his blazing, furious eyes directly on me. In his twisted mind, I was the villain. I was the one who had exposed the rot. I was the one who had refused to play my part and protect the family's secrets. "You think this is funny?" Harrison screamed, his voice cracking with intense, hysterical fury. "You think you can just orchestrate this massive public humiliation and walk away unscathed? You think your little corporate takeover makes you invincible, Naomi?" He pointed a trembling, bloodless finger directly at my face. "You have made an enemy of this family today. You have crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. I do not care how many shell companies you own. I do not care how much money you think you have hoarded in that private equity firm. I am going to destroy you." Harrison's chest heaved as he stepped closer to me, his face contorted in a mask of pure vengeance. "I am calling Richard Cooper right now. I am calling the best family lawyers in this entire state. We are going to audit every single transaction you have ever made. We are going to find a loophole in your little corporate bylaws. I will personally drag you through years of exhausting, brutal litigation until you are entirely bankrupt. We will strip you of your title. We will freeze your assets. We will take every single dime you possess and leave you rotting in the gutter where you belong. You hear me, Naomi? You are finished." Julian pushed himself off the floor, spitting a mouthful of blood onto his own ruined carpet. He leaned heavily against the shattered display cabinet, clutching his bruised ribs. He looked at Harrison and then turned his venomous glare toward me. The two men who had just been trying to kill each other were now suddenly united by their shared hatred for the woman who had bested them both. "Your father is absolutely right, Naomi." Julian sneered, his voice thick and wet. "You made a fatal miscalculation today. You walked into my territory and thought you could play God. But you forgot who you are dealing with. My family does not just have money, we have power, real systemic power. My father plays golf with the state governor every single Sunday. One phone call from my family and the State Financial Commission will freeze every single asset Apex Capital holds by tomorrow morning. We will bury your company in endless federal audits until you cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee." Vivian immediately stepped away from the sobbing Sarah and moved to stand proudly beside her husband and Julian. She smoothed her designer dress, lifting her chin with that familiar, terrifying arrogance. "We are going to crush you, Naomi," Vivian stated, her voice dripping with maternal poison. "You tried to destroy your sister's marriage and humiliate this family, but you only destroyed yourself. You are going to sign over the rights to Apex Capital to Julian to compensate him for the emotional distress you caused today. If you do exactly as we say, we might let you walk away with a small allowance." I did not laugh. I simply stared at them, fascinated by the sheer depth of their delusion. "You are going to call the governor?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat. "You are going to ask the state to audit my firm?" Harrison let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded more like a bark. "We do not even need the governor," Harrison declared, taking a step closer to me. His eyes gleamed with a wicked, victorious light. He thought he was about to play his masterstroke. "You always thought you were the smartest person in the room, Naomi. You thought you could outmaneuver me. But you forgot that I have owned you since the day you were born." He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning forward with a sickeningly triumphant smile. "Do you remember your 18th birthday, Naomi? Do you remember the stack of papers I brought to your room? I told you they were documents to establish your college savings account. I told you to sign them quickly so we could go out to dinner. You were so desperate for my approval, you did not even read a single page. You just signed exactly where I told you to." The memory surfaced instantly. The heavy cream-colored paper, the expensive pen my father had placed in my hand, the rare smile he had given me when I did exactly what he asked without questioning him. I kept my face completely blank, giving him absolutely nothing. You did not sign up for a college fund, Naomi Harrison continued, his voice dropping into a malicious whisper. You signed the incorporation papers for a shell company. I needed a place to dump $3 million in toxic corporate debt and unpaid back taxes from my early real estate ventures. I put the entire company entirely in your name. For the last 10 years, you have been the sole legal owner of a fraudulent corporation that owes the Internal Revenue Service millions of dollars. Chloe gasped, a wide, delighted smile spreading across her face. She looked at our father with sheer admiration. You set her up, Chloe cheered, clapping her hands together. Dad, that is brilliant. Harrison did not break eye contact with me. He wanted to watch me break. I have the original documents locked in a secure vault, Naomi. I have your original signature. If you do not hand over total control of Apex Capital to this family by midnight, I am going to mail those documents directly to the federal authorities. They will not just seize your company, they will arrest you. You will spend the next 20 years in a federal prison for tax evasion and corporate fraud. The entire room fell into a heavy, triumphant silence. Julian wiped the blood from his chin, standing up a little straighter. Sarah had stopped crying, watching me from the floor with vindictive satisfaction. Marcus remained frozen in the corner, completely broken, but watching the scene unfold with hollow, dead eyes. My mother and sister stood beside my father, radiating pure joy at the prospect of my complete destruction. They had formed a unified, impenetrable alliance. The Jacksons and the Bradleys standing together on the shattered remains of my dignity. They waited for me to fall to my knees. They waited for the panic to set in. They waited for me to beg my father for mercy, to offer them my entire empire just to stay out of a prison cell. I looked at Harrison. I looked at the man who had deliberately planned to ruin my entire life when I was just 18 years old. He had weaponized my childhood trust to protect his own greed. He was willing to throw his own daughter into a federal penitentiary just to maintain his country club membership and his pristine social image. I reached down and calmly snapped the twin locks of my custom leather briefcase shut. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the silent office. I picked up the briefcase by its solid brass handles and adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I looked around the destroyed executive office, taking in the shattered glass, the spilled coffee, the blood on the carpet, and the pathetic group of people standing before me. I did not yell. I did not explain myself. I did not offer a single word of defense or panic. I simply looked at my father and offered him a chillingly serene smile. You have always been a terrible chess player, Harrison. I said, my voice soft, but carrying a lethal weight that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. You only ever look one move ahead. You never bother to check the entire board. Harrison frowned, returned his triumphant smile, faltering. What is that supposed to mean? He demanded, taking a hesitant step forward. I did not answer him. I turned my back on the entire alliance. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the heavy oak doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. The security guards immediately stepped aside, clearing a wide path for me. I stopped right at the threshold and looked over my shoulder, glancing back at the ruined people who thought they had just defeated me. I will see you all tomorrow night at the Winter Gala, I said, my voice ringing with absolute deadly certainty. Make sure you dress up. It is going to be a highly publicized event. I stepped out of the office and let the heavy doors click shut behind me, leaving them trapped inside their own burning building. The sterile air of the executive corridor felt refreshing against my skin as I walked away from the chaos. The muffled sounds of my father shouting and Julian cursing faded into the background as the heavy oak doors clicked shut. I pressed the elevator button and watched the metallic doors slide open. I stepped inside and checked my reflection in the mirrored panel. My tailored suit was immaculate. My pulse was a steady resting rhythm. I had just dismantled the false empires of the people who abused me, and I had never felt more alive. The elevator delivered me to the underground parking garage where my custom black Lincoln Navigator was already idling. My driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door. I slid into the plush leather seat and let out a slow, measured breath. The tinted windows isolated me from the rest of the world. "Take me to the estate," I told the driver. As the heavy SUV glided smoothly onto the bustling Atlanta streets, the city lights washed over the windows. If a camera had been tracking my face, it would have captured a woman entirely at peace. Harrison thought his little revelation about the shell company was a brilliant checkmate. He actually believed a piece of paper signed by a naive 18-year-old girl was enough to hold me hostage. He severely underestimated the woman I had become. I remembered that day perfectly. I had been so desperate for my father's approval. He brought a stack of legal documents to my bedroom and told me they were for a specialized college savings account. He handed me his expensive gold pen and told me to sign on the dotted lines so we could go out for a celebratory family dinner. I did not read a single page. I just wanted him to look at me the way he looked at Chloe. It was not until years later, when I was building my own financial portfolio, that I hired a forensic accountant to look into my assets. That was when I discovered the horrific truth. My father had used my signature to incorporate a fraudulent shell company. He used my name to absorb $3 million in toxic commercial debt and unpaid back taxes from his failing real estate ventures. He had effectively set me up to take the fall for his federal crimes. I did not confront him when I found out. I did not cry. I played the long game. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a secure encrypted satellite phone. I did not use my personal cell for this specific contact. I dialed a direct secure line that bypassed all secretaries and reception desks. It rang exactly twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. "Prosecutor Sterling speaking." "Good evening, Richard," I said, leaning back against the leather headrest. "I hope I am not interrupting your dinner." "For you, Naomi. I always have time," the federal prosecutor replied, his tone shifting into one of eager anticipation. "Tell me you have the final pieces. My task force has been itching to move on this for 6 months. I have absolutely everything," I confirmed, staring out at the passing headlights. Harrison Jackson just tried to blackmail me with the original incorporation documents from the shell company he forced me to sign 10 years ago. He bragged about keeping them in his private vault. He intends to use them to frame me for his own tax evasion and corporate fraud. Sterling let out a low whistle. He is cornered and desperate. But a signature from a teenager does not negate a decade of systematic wire fraud. "Exactly," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Harrison was so incredibly arrogant that he never bothered to check the corporate registry after I turned 21. The moment I gained legal control of my own finances, I quietly restructured that entire entity. I transferred the voting rights into a blind trust and spent the last 5 years meticulously tracking every single dollar he funneled through it. I have the routing numbers. I have the offshore account details. I have the digital footprint proving he was the sole beneficiary and active operator of the fraudulent accounts. He practically built the federal case against himself. "This is brilliant," Naomi Sterling said, the excitement clear in his voice. "If he tries to submit those original documents to threaten you, he will literally be handing us the final piece of physical evidence we need to establish his initial intent to commit fraud. It is the smoking gun. I am transmitting the complete encrypted dossier to your secure server right now," I said, tapping the screen of my tablet. "It includes the audio recording of him attempting to extort me today in Julian office. You have his full confession on tape. I want the asset freeze implemented by tomorrow morning. I want his bank accounts locked, his commercial properties seized, and his passports flagged." "Consider it done," Sterling promised. "The grand jury will have a field day with this evidence. Harrison Jackson will be federally indicted before the end of the week. He is going to lose absolutely everything. Make sure the arrest warrant is drafted meticulously," I instructed. "I want no loopholes. He spent his entire life building a psychological cage for me. It is only fitting that he spends the rest of his life sitting inside a real one." I ended the call and slipped the satellite phone back into my briefcase. The trap was set and the door was permanently locked. Harrison thought he held a lethal weapon against my head, but he had actually been holding a loaded gun to his own chest for 10 years. The Lincoln Navigator turned off the main highway and began the steep, winding ascent into the most exclusive gated community in the state. The trees parted to reveal a massive, sprawling estate. It was a property that dwarfed even the lavish mansions my parents and Julian worshipped. The driveway was lined with manicured hedges and soft ambient lighting that illuminated the towering stone columns of the grand entrance. This was the pinnacle of systemic power. This was the exact place Julian had bragged about. He had stood in his office with a bleeding face and loudly threatened me with his family political connections. He had promised that one phone call to the state governor would freeze my assets and destroy my firm. Julian believed his father weekend golf games gave him absolute immunity from consequences. He believed the political elite would always protect their own. The SUV rolled to a smooth stop directly in front of the massive double doors of the mansion. My driver hurried around to open my door, but before he could reach the handle, the front doors of the estate swung open. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a sharp-tailored tuxedo stepped out onto the portico. He bypassed his own security detail and walked straight down the stone steps toward my vehicle. He reached out and opened the car door himself, offering me a warm, genuinely respectful smile. "Naomi, it is an absolute honor to see you," the state governor said, extending his hand to help me out of the vehicle. I took his hand and stepped gracefully onto the pristine driveway. "Good evening, Governor," I replied, matching his warm tone. "I appreciate you hosting me on such short notice. For the primary financial backer of my re-election campaign, my doors are always open." The governor laughed, placing a friendly hand on my shoulder and guiding me toward the mansion. "Besides, my chief of staff tells me Apex Capital is preparing to fund the new statewide infrastructure initiative. We have a lot of incredibly profitable details to discuss tonight." "We certainly do," I agreed, stepping into the grand foyer of his estate. Julian and my father thought they had the political system in their pockets. They thought sharing a golf cart on a Sunday morning equated to real power. They did not understand that I did not play golf with politicians. I funded them. I owned the infrastructure. I held the keys to the state economic growth. The governor led me into his private study, a room filled with rich leather and rare books. He poured 2 glasses of expensive bourbon and handed one to me. "I hear the Jackson and Bradley families are experiencing some severe financial turbulence today," the governor noted, taking a casual sip of his drink. "Julian father called my office about an hour ago. He was frantic, screaming something about a hostile takeover and begging me to intervene on his behalf." I took a slow, appreciative sip of the bourbon. "And what did you tell him, Governor?" "I told him my administration does not interfere in legitimate private equity acquisitions." The governor smiled, his eyes gleaming with shrewd understanding. "Especially when the acquiring firm is led by someone as capable and vital to this state as you, Naomi." I advised him to hire a very good bankruptcy lawyer. "Excellent advice," I replied, setting my glass down on the desk. The board was completely cleared. Every single threat they had thrown at me had been neutralized. They were stripped of their wealth, their social standing, and their political protection. They were entirely isolated and facing total annihilation. Tomorrow night was the Winter Gala. It was the most prestigious high society event of the year. My family would undoubtedly show up desperate to maintain their facade of wealth and power. They would put on their expensive clothes and their fake smiles, and they would try to pretend their world was not actively burning to the ground. I looked out the window of the governor's study, watching the city lights glitter in the distance. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Tomorrow night, the entire city would watch their absolute destruction. And I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The crisp winter air of Atlanta was electrified by the rapid fire flashes of hundreds of camera lenses. The annual Winter Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of the city high society calendar, and the red carpet stretching across the grand plaza of the Botanical Gardens was a battlefield of wealth and status. Velvet ropes held back throngs of eager onlookers and aggressive journalists, desperate for a quote from the financial elite. A sleek silver limousine glided to a halt at the edge of the carpet. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of polite applause and shouted questions as my father Harrison stepped out, adjusting the lapels of his custom tuxedo. He offered his arm to my mother Vivian, who looked positively regal in a sweeping emerald green gown draped in diamonds. Close behind them, Chloe emerged, linking arms with Julian. They were a carefully choreographed portrait of invincible legacy power. They smiled for the cameras, projecting an absolute illusion of untouchable dominance. They had spent the last 24 hours scrambling to contain the damage from Julian's destroyed office, but tonight they were acting as if they owned the entire world. In their minds, my silence since our confrontation meant Harrison's threat had worked. They genuinely believed I was currently curled up in a dark room, terrified of federal prison and preparing to sign over my company. "Mr. Bradley," a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone over the velvet rope. "Rumors are circulating about a massive restructuring within your firm. Can you comment on the sudden changes?" Julian flashed his perfectly capped teeth, adopting a posture of supreme confidence. "We are simply streamlining our operations to prepare for an unprecedented quarter of growth." Julian lied smoothly, his arm wrapped tightly around Chloe's waist. "The Bradley and Jackson families are stronger and more united than ever. We are moving into a new era of prosperity." Chloe leaned toward the microphones, batting her eyelashes with practiced innocence. "Our family is deeply committed to our legacy," Chloe added, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We only surround ourselves with people who understand the value of loyalty and hard work." Another reporter pushed to the front. "Speaking of family, Chloe, where's your sister Naomi tonight? We have not seen her at a society event in months. Is she still involved in the family portfolio?" My mother let out a soft, condescending laugh that was picked up by the nearest microphones. "Naomi has always struggled to find her footing in our fast-paced world," Vivian said, shaking her head with fake maternal pity. "The corporate environment is simply too demanding for someone of her delicate temperament. She is currently taking an extended leave of absence to deal with some personal failures. We prefer to let her rest in private, away from the pressures of polite society. She is hiding away, finding herself. You know how these things go." Harrison nodded solemnly, placing a protective hand on Vivian's shoulder. "It is a private family tragedy," Harrison lied, looking directly into the camera lens. "But we continue to support her from afar, while we focus on the real leaders of tomorrow, like Julian and Chloe." The journalist furiously scribbled down the quotes, eating up the narrative of the disgraced, incompetent sister. The Bradley and Jackson families turned back to the cameras, posing for another round of photographs, reveling in their public character assassination. Then the flashing lights suddenly stopped. A deep rumbling vibration echoed down the avenue, cutting through the chatter of the crowd. The sharp wail of police sirens pierced the crisp night air. A fleet of 6 imposing matte black SUVs, flanked by 4 police motorcycles, aggressively turned onto the plaza. The motorcade did not slow down to drop off passengers at the back of the line. The police escorts drove straight up to the very front of the red carpet, forcing the event organizers to scramble and move the velvet barricades. The sheer aggressive display of unadulterated power instantly silenced the entire plaza. Even Harrison and Julian lowered their hands, staring at the motorcade in absolute confusion. This was not the standard arrival of a local wealthy family. This was the arrival of a visiting head of state or a corporate titan of terrifying magnitude. The lead SUV stopped directly at the start of the Crimson Runner. 4 massive men in identical black suits stepped out simultaneously, forming a synchronized human wall facing the crowd. One of the security agents reached for the rear door handle. The entire press corps held their collective breath, waiting to see what kind of billionaire commanded this level of security. The heavy armored door swung open. I stepped out onto the pavement. I was not hiding. I was not broken. I was a vision of absolute lethal power. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue evening gown, heavily encrusted with thousands of dark crystals that caught the camera flashes and threw the light back like shattered glass. The dress featured a high-structured collar and a plunging neckline that radiated aggressive corporate dominance wrapped in high-fashion armor. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless style, and a single diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. The silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the entire plaza exploded. The press corps surged forward, pressing so hard against the velvet ropes that the metal stanchions began to tip. Camera flashes erupted in a blinding, continuous strobe effect. A dozen television cameras swung entirely away from my family and locked directly onto me. Is that Naomi Jackson, a reporter shrieked, pointing wildly. Wait, look at the security detail, another journalist yelled, holding up his phone. That is the corporate seal of Apex Capital on their lapel pins. That is her. She is the founder. Naomi Jackson is the CEO of Apex Capital. The realization ripped through the crowd like a shockwave. The mysterious, ruthless private equity titan, who had been buying up half the commercial real estate in the city, was not an anonymous foreign investor. It was the disgraced sister. The woman her family had just claimed was a fragile failure hiding from the world was actually the apex predator of their entire financial ecosystem. I did not look at the cameras. I did not wave. I simply stood tall and let the world take me in. The television cameras swept around me in a continuous orbiting arc, capturing the glittering crystals of my gown, the stoic wall of my security detail, and the sheer, undeniable authority radiating from my posture. I began to walk down the red carpet, my heels gliding smoothly over the plush fabric. My guards moved with me, executing a flawless diamond formation that kept the frantic reporters at bay while allowing them a perfect view. Ms. Jackson, one reporter screamed, leaning over a bodyguard's shoulder. Is it true your firm just initiated a hostile takeover of Bradley Enterprises? Ms. Jackson, another voice bellowed. Are you responsible for the massive financial shifts in the downtown sector today? I ignored them, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead. As I walked down the center of the carpet, the crowd parted organically. I finally locked eyes with my family standing near the entrance of the grand ballroom. The smug, confident smiles had been completely obliterated from their faces. Chloe looked as if she had just been slapped physically, taking a step backward and hiding behind Julian. Julian was trembling, his jaw tight, as he stared at the corporate seal on my bodyguard suits, confirming his absolute worst nightmare. My mother clutched her diamond necklace, her mouth hanging open in undignified shock. But it was Harrison who looked the most devastated. His face was a mottled purplish red. The illusion of his control was shattering on live television. He saw the way the press swarmed me. He saw the raw power I commanded. He suddenly realized that his blackmail attempt had failed spectacularly. The naive 18-year-old girl he thought he could control had evolved into an untouchable titan, and she was currently walking right into his territory to publicly execute him. Harrison's panic instantly morphed into feral, irrational anger. He could not accept the narrative shifting. He could not tolerate me stealing his spotlight. He broke away from my mother and marched directly toward the head of the gala's security team, a burly man standing near the grand doors. "Stop her!" Harrison barked, his voice cracking with hysterical rage loudly enough for the nearest microphones to pick up. "Do not let her take another step. She is not on the guest list." The security chief looked confused, glancing from Harrison to my imposing wall of bodyguards. "Sir, this is a highly publicized event. We cannot just—" "I am a platinum sponsor of this foundation," Harrison roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "That woman does not have a ticket. She is a disgraced outcast, and she is trespassing on private property. I want her removed immediately. Block the doors. Do not let her inside." The gala security guards hesitated, but Harrison's relentless screaming spurred them into action. 4 guards stepped onto the red carpet directly into my path, raising their hands to halt my progression. The press corps gasped, falling silent as a physical confrontation loomed on the pristine carpet. The cameras zoomed in, focusing tightly on the standoff. My father stood behind the guards, breathing heavily, a desperate, triumphant snarl returning to his face. He thought he could still control the physical space. He thought he could still shut me out. I stopped walking. My bodyguards instantly tightened their formation, but I raised a single gloved hand, signaling them to stand down. I looked at the security guards blocking my path, and then I looked directly at Harrison. I offered him a slow, terrifying smile that promised absolute ruin. The 4 security guards took another hesitant step forward, forming a solid human barricade between me and the glittering entrance of the gala. Harrison was practically vibrating with malicious glee. Seeing my progress physically halted gave him an overwhelming surge of false confidence. He turned his back on me and faced the frantic press corps, throwing his arms wide open to command their absolute attention. "Listen to me," Harrison bellowed, his voice carrying over the snapping of camera shutters. "This woman is a complete imposter. She is not the chief executive of any financial firm. She is my disgraced daughter Naomi, and she has suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She has been estranged from this family for months due to her erratic and dangerous behavior. She is a fraud attempting to crash a private event, and she is currently under active federal investigation for corporate tax evasion." The journalists gasped, scribbling furiously on their notepads. Vivian immediately stepped up beside her husband, placing a hand on her chest in a flawless display of fake maternal sorrow. "It is a tragedy," Vivian announced loud enough for the microphones to capture every word. "We have tried so hard to get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs. But she refuses treatment. Coming here tonight with hired thugs and a fake corporate title is just another one of her psychotic delusions. Please do not give her the attention she is so clearly begging for." Chloe leaned into the frame, nodding vigorously. "She has always been jealous of my success and my marriage," Chloe chimed in, adopting a sickly sweet tone of victimhood. "She is just trying to ruin the most important night of the year because she has absolutely nothing of her own." I stood perfectly still, letting their toxic lies wash over me. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I just let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could on live statewide television. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they did not notice the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swinging wide open. "Step aside." The command was not shouted, but it carried an undeniable authority that instantly froze the entire plaza. The 4 security guards blocking my path visibly stiffened. Governor Sterling walked out onto the red carpet, flanked by a half-dozen armed state troopers. He looked absolutely immaculate in his tailored tuxedo, his expression set in lines of cold, hard authority. The flashing cameras immediately pivoted toward the most powerful political figure in the state. Harrison's face lit up with profound relief. He actually thought his Sunday golf partner had come outside to personally save him from embarrassment. Harrison took a step forward, reaching out to shake the governor's hand. "Arthur, thank God you are here," Harrison said, his voice dripping with sycophantic familiarity. "You need to have your state troopers arrest this woman immediately. She is causing a massive public disturbance and trespassing on a private foundation event." Governor Sterling did not even look at Harrison. He walked right past my father, leaving Harrison standing with his hand extended in empty air. The governor stopped directly in front of me and offered a warm, respectful smile that was entirely genuine. "Naomi," the governor said, his voice projecting clearly for every single reporter to hear. "I apologize for the confusion at the door. It seems some of the local guests are completely unaware of who is actually hosting them tonight." He offered me his arm. I reached out and looped my hand through the crook of his elbow. The entire press corps went dead silent. The collective shock radiating from the crowd was palpable. Governor Sterling turned to face the sea of cameras, his posture radiating absolute dominance. He gestured toward me with his free hand. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," the governor announced, his voice booming across the plaza, "I would like to officially introduce you to the true visionary behind tonight's event. Ms. Naomi Jackson is the founder and sole chief executive officer of Apex Capital, and it is my great honor to announce that Apex Capital is not only the savior of our state new infrastructure initiative, but they are also the exclusive $50 million sponsor of tonight's Winter Gala." The silence shattered. The reporters lost their minds, screaming questions and shoving recording devices over the velvet ropes. The cameras fired so rapidly that the plaza looked like it was caught in a lightning storm. $50 million, a reporter shrieked. "Governor, is it true that Apex Capital just absorbed Bradley Enterprises?" "Ms. Jackson," another journalist hollered, "your father just claimed you were a mentally unstable fraud facing federal charges. Do you have a response to his allegations?" I looked at Harrison. He looked as though he had just been physically struck by a freight train. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly pale gray. His jaw hung open, his eyes wide with an unadulterated terror he could no longer hide. The realization hit him with the force of an executioner blade. The governor was not his ally. The governor belonged to me. Vivian literally stumbled backward, her perfectly manicured hands flying to cover her mouth. The social empire she had spent 4 decades building had just been publicly vaporized. She had just called the most powerful financial titan in the state a psychotic fraud on live television. Her country club reputation was dead. Her social standing was eradicated. She was nothing. Julian stood paralyzed near the entrance, sweating profusely. He finally understood the absolute finality of his ruin. He knew that if I had $50 million to casually drop on a charity gala sponsorship, his own firm was completely and utterly helpless against my resources. Governor Sterling looked at Harrison with an expression of profound disgust. "Mr. Jackson," the governor said, his voice dropping into a register of icy contempt, "if I ever hear you speak about the most important financial benefactor in this state with such brazen disrespect again, I will personally ensure your remaining assets are audited until you are living in a cardboard box. Now step aside. You are blocking the guest of honor." Harrison could not speak. He could not breathe. He stumbled awkwardly to the side, pulling Vivian and Chloe with him. They shrank against the velvet ropes, looking like pathetic, frightened peasants, as the true royalty of the evening prepared to pass them by. "Shall we proceed inside?" the governor asked me, offering a polite nod. "We absolutely shall," I replied. The governor led me down the red carpet. My imposing wall of bodyguards flanked us seamlessly, parting the remaining crowd like the Red Sea. We walked past my shattered family without giving them a second glance. We stepped through the grand mahogany doors and entered the magnificent ballroom. The interior of the venue was breathtaking. Thousands of crystal teardrops hung from the vaulted ceilings, catching the light of massive ornate chandeliers. Tables draped in heavy white silk were covered in towering floral arrangements and fine silver. The room was packed with the most elite, influential figures in the city. As the governor and I walked down the grand central staircase, the orchestra abruptly stopped playing. The low hum of high society gossip faded into absolute silence. Every single head in the room turned to watch us. They parted, making a wide, clear path for me to walk through. They stared at my midnight blue gown, the diamonds resting against my skin, and the raw, undeniable power radiating from my every step. I was no longer the quiet, obedient daughter. I was the architect of their financial world. I let go of the governor's arm and walked gracefully toward the front of the room. The main stage was elevated above the dining tables, bathed in soft golden spotlights. I climbed the short flight of stairs and stepped directly up to the crystal-clear acrylic podium. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Hundreds of the wealthiest people in the state were staring up at me, waiting for me to speak. I looked toward the back of the room and saw the heavy doors open. Harrison, Vivian, Chloe, and Julian crept inside, hiding in the shadows near the coat check. They looked terrified, humiliated, and utterly defeated. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that contained absolutely no mercy. I leaned forward and tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic thumping echoed through the massive sound system, demanding total submission from the audience. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting with flawless crystal clarity across the massive ballroom. "I have an important announcement regarding the Jackson Family Charitable Foundation." I slowly reached down and gently peeled her trembling fingers off the fabric of my gown. I took a step back, removing myself entirely from her grasp. I leaned into the microphone, ensuring every single person in the room heard my response. "You stopped being my mother the day you decided my existence was an inconvenience, Vivian," I said, my voice perfectly steady, radiating a freezing detachment that chilled the entire room. "You sold my dignity to protect your diamonds. You watched Harrison try to frame me for his crimes, and you smiled. You do not get to invoke family now that your bank accounts are empty." Vivian let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. She curled inward, shaking violently against the stage floor. "Naomi," she whimpered, her voice barely a breath. "Please, I am not your little girl." I stated the words echoing off the vaulted ceilings with lethal finality. "I am the consequence of every single choice you made. And my consequences do not come with a bailout." I turned away from her pathetic, weeping form. Down on the floor, the federal agents were already escorting Harrison toward the exit. His head was bowed, his hands secured tightly behind his back. The flashing lights of the police cruisers outside illuminated the stained glass windows, casting long, fractured shadows across the ballroom. The elite guests remained frozen, trapped in the sheer magnitude of the public execution they had just witnessed. I looked out over the crowd, adjusting my posture with effortless grace. As the exclusive sponsor of tonight's event, I would like to assure the actual philanthropic organizations present that Apex Capital will be fully funding your charitable grants by tomorrow morning. I announced, my tone seamlessly shifting back into that of a commanding chief executive. The era of the Jackson family fraud is officially over. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I stepped away from the podium. My security detail instantly closed ranks around me, forming an impenetrable shield of black suits. We walked down the opposite staircase, leaving Vivian sobbing alone on the elevated stage. The crowd parted silently, refusing to make eye contact, stepping back to give me a wide berth. They did not just respect me now, they feared me. I walked out of the grand ballroom and into the crisp winter night. The air tasted clean and sharp. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles painted the plaza in a chaotic glow, but I did not stop to watch them load my family into the back of the transport vans. I had already seen exactly what I came to see. My custom Lincoln Navigator pulled up to the curb. The driver opened the door and I stepped inside, sinking into the plush leather. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside the quiet sanctuary of my own making. As the SUV pulled away from the botanical gardens, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the console. I took a slow, quiet sip and watched the city lights roll by, knowing that tomorrow morning the world would wake up to an entirely new empire. For decades, the Jackson Family Foundation has been celebrated as a pillar of philanthropy in this state. I continued my gaze, sweeping over the upturned faces of the elite. You have all attended these galas. You have all written generous checks. You believed you were funding children's hospitals and community development programs. I raised a small, sleek remote control and pressed a single button. The massive digital screens behind the stage, which had previously been displaying the foundation logo, instantly shifted. The elegant gold lettering vanished. In its place, a staggering array of financial documents materialized. Bank ledgers, offshore account routing numbers, and heavily redacted shell company charters illuminated the ballroom in a harsh, sterile light. The collective gasp from the audience was deafening. What you were actually funding was a sophisticated money laundering syndicate, I announced, my voice echoing with lethal precision. Every single dollar donated to this foundation over the past 5 years has been systematically rerouted. It was funneled through dummy corporations headquartered in the Cayman Islands and directly into the private black funds controlled by Julian Bradley and his chief financial associate, Marcus Thorne. The screens shifted again, displaying undeniable high-resolution images of signed wire transfers. Julian's signature was clearly visible next to Marcus Thorne, authorizing the movement of millions of dollars into untouchable offshore accounts. "That is a complete fabrication," Julian screamed from the back of the room. He was shoving his way forward, his face flushed with panic. "She has hacked the system. Those documents are forged. Shut those screens off right now." I did not even blink. I pressed another button on my remote. The screens transitioned to play a crisp audio recording accompanied by a scrolling transcript. It was Julian's own voice, arrogant and sneering, captured during a private meeting with Marcus just 3 weeks ago. "We wash the real estate capital through the foundation charity accounts," Julian's voice echoed through the massive ballroom speakers. "The old man is too blind to notice the discrepancies, and his idiot daughter signed the incorporation papers years ago. If the feds ever come sniffing around, we just point the finger at Naomi and walk away clean. We take the $50 million and we let her rot in a federal cell." The audio recording ended, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The high society guests turned as one to stare at Julian and Marcus. The wealthy philanthropists, the politicians, the hospital board members, they all realized simultaneously that they had been scammed. Their charitable donations had bought Julian new sports cars and financed Marcus lavish vacations. The disgust in the room was a tangible physical force. Julian stumbled backward. The arrogant swagger of the untouchable white elite completely evaporated from his posture. He looked at the screens and then at the furious faces surrounding him. He realized there was no political connection or golf club membership that could save him from his own recorded confession. Marcus, a tall man who had been attempting to blend into the shadows near the bar, suddenly panicked. "We have to get out of here," Marcus yelled, grabbing Julian by the arm. The two men abandoned all pretense of dignity. They shoved elite guests out of the way, knocking over a tray of champagne flutes that shattered loudly against the marble floor. They sprinted toward the grand mahogany doors at the rear entrance of the ballroom, desperate to escape the blinding light of their own exposure. They slammed their bodies against the heavy doors, throwing them open and rushing into the corridor. They did not make it more than 3 steps. The corridor was not empty. A tactical team of heavily armed federal agents stood in a solid, impenetrable line blocking the exit. At the front of the formation, Prosecutor Sterling stood with his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Going somewhere, gentlemen?" Sterling asked, stepping forward. Julian froze, his eyes darting frantically for another exit. There were none. Federal agents poured into the ballroom, sealing every single door and securing the perimeter. The flashing lights of police cruisers illuminated the windows outside. The trap had snapped shut with absolute perfection. "Julian Bradley and Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy," Sterling announced, his voice carrying over the panicked murmur of the crowd. 2 federal agents grabbed Julian, twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed sharply in the silent room. The heavy steel locked securely around the wrists of the men who had once considered themselves the untouchable elite. Julian struggled, his face contorted in a mix of rage and terror, but the agents held him with effortless strength. Marcus simply collapsed to his knees, weeping openly as the cuffs were secured. Harrison watched his empire burn to ash. Federal agents were already moving toward him, producing their own sets of handcuffs. He had built his entire life on the illusion of superiority, and now he was being publicly paraded as a common criminal. The legacy he worshipped was dead. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Guests were shouting, reporters were frantically recording the arrests, and the foundation board members were desperately trying to distance themselves from my family. It was a symphony of destruction, and I had orchestrated every single note. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the noise. "Naomi, please!" Vivian broke through the crowd. My mother, the woman who prided herself on absolute poise and emotional control, was completely unraveling. She sprinted up the short flight of stairs to the stage, tripping over the hem of her expensive emerald gown. She did not stop to regain her footing. She practically threw herself across the stage floor, collapsing directly at my feet. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed handfuls of my glittering midnight blue dress. Her perfect makeup was smeared with tears. Her diamond necklace was askew. She looked up at me, her face twisted in an expression of pure, unfiltered desperation. "Naomi, my little girl." Vivian sobbed, burying her face in the fabric of my gown. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a mistake. They are taking your father. They are taking Julian. You cannot do this to your own family. Please, I am begging you. Forgive us." I looked down at the woman who had watched me suffer for years. I looked at the mother who had willingly participated in my planned destruction just so she could keep her country club memberships. She was crying real tears, but they were not tears of remorse for what she had done to me. They were tears of terror for what she was about to lose. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The well of my empathy had dried up a long time ago. I remained perfectly still. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not pull away. I just let the entire ballroom and the countless cameras watch the grand matriarch of the Jackson family begging on her knees for the mercy she had never once shown her own daughter. I stared down at Vivian, my expression an impenetrable mask of ice. I reached down and firmly peeled her trembling manicured fingers off the fabric of my gown. I took a deliberate step backward, removing myself entirely from her pathetic grasp. I did not bend down to help her. I did not offer a single syllable of comfort. The silence in the ballroom was heavy enough to crush bone. Then the silence was ripped apart by a high-pitched, hysterical scream. "You cold-blooded monster." Chloe stormed towards the stage, her face distorted with a hideous mix of smeared mascara and absolute fury. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her diamond bracelets clinking against her wrist. "You planned all of this. You set us up from the very beginning. You are a psychopath, Naomi. You are destroying your own flesh and blood, and you are actually standing there smiling about it. You will never have a moment of peace. You will never be happy because you are too cruel to ever be loved. You are going to die alone in your billions." Her voice cracked, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. She expected me to react. She expected the crowd to murmur in sympathy. She expected her dramatic victimhood to work just as it always had. I adjusted my posture, resting my hands on the edges of the clear acrylic podium. "Happiness is a luxury, Chloe," I said, my voice projecting evenly and flawlessly across the vast room. "But justice is an absolute necessity, and tonight we are entirely focused on justice." I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, subtle nod toward the back of the room. My lead corporate attorney, Richard, stepped out from the shadows, flanked by 3 process servers in sharp, dark suits. They moved with mechanical efficiency, walking straight onto the main floor. The elite crowd parted for them, instantly sensing the lethal nature of their approach. One server walked directly up to Harrison, who was still being restrained by the federal agents, and shoved a thick manila folder into the breast pocket of his custom tuxedo. Another walked up the stage stairs and dropped a heavy stack of documents directly onto Vivian's lap as she remained kneeling on the floor. The third stepped right up to Chloe and pressed a sealed envelope firmly against her chest. "What is this?" Chloe demanded, swatting blindly at the envelope. "Get this garbage away from me." I leaned closer to the microphone. "Those are asset forfeiture and immediate seizure notices," I announced, the words echoing with lethal precision. "Because your lavish lifestyle was entirely funded by the money Julian and Marcus stole from the foundation charities, every single asset you currently possess is classified as the proceeds of federal crimes." Vivian's hands shook violently as she tore open the folder on her lap. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, and the color drained completely from her face. She let out a small, suffocated gasp, as if the air had been punched out of her lungs. "As of this exact moment," I continued, my voice devoid of any pity, "your bank accounts have been permanently frozen. The commercial properties have been seized by the federal government. The estate in the gated community is currently surrounded by federal marshals, and the locks are being changed as we speak. Your custom vehicles have been impounded. Every single credit card in your designer wallets will be declined if you attempt to use them." "No." Vivian gasped, clutching the papers to her chest. "No, you cannot do this. We have nowhere to go." "We have nothing. You have exactly what you earned, Vivian," I stated coldly. "You are completely and utterly bankrupt. You have zero equity, zero credit, and zero political protection. You are officially destitute." Chloe ripped open her envelope and stared at the bold red stamp across the top page. Her hands trembled so violently that the thick paper actually tore. "This is illegal!" she shrieked, looking wildly around the room. "You cannot just take our money. We are the Jackson family. We own this city. You own absolutely nothing." "Chloe," I corrected her, "you do not even own the dress you are wearing tonight. It was purchased with stolen charity funds, and the authorities will be collecting it before morning." The sheer reality of their absolute ruin crashed down on them. They were not just facing criminal charges. They were stripped of their entire identity. The wealth that had shielded them from consequence, the money they had used to torment and control me, it was all gone in an instant. They were entirely exposed. Harrison struggled violently against the federal agents, his face purple with unhinged rage. "Arthur," he yelled across the room, looking desperately at the governor. "Arthur, you cannot let her do this. We are friends. We are partners. Say something. Stop her." Governor Sterling stood perfectly still, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. He did not say a word. He simply turned his head, looking away from my father in a gesture of profound absolute dismissal. Vivian scrambled to her feet, clutching her ruined emerald gown. She looked toward the front tables filled with the society women she had hosted at lavish luncheons for decades. "Martha," she cried out, stumbling toward a woman dripping in rare pearls. "Martha, please tell your husband to call his lawyers. We need a ride. We need help. Please, Martha, we have been friends for 20 years." Martha physically recoiled. She took 2 rapid steps backward, grabbing her husband's arm and pulling him away from Vivian as if my mother were highly contagious. The entire table shifted, turning their backs on the Jackson matriarch. They lifted their champagne flutes and looked pointedly at the ceiling, refusing to acknowledge her existence. Chloe ran toward a group of young corporate executives she had partied with just last weekend. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking with raw panic. "Someone let me use a phone. Someone give me a ride to the hotel. Please, I just need a little help." The young executives looked at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. One of them actually raised a dinner menu to block his face. The social elite of Atlanta, the people who had kissed the Jackson family rings for years, were brutal in their self-preservation. They saw the federal agents. They saw the frozen accounts. They saw the absolute dominant power I commanded from the stage. No one was going to risk their own standing to help a sinking ship. The crowd physically parted, creating a wide, empty circle of isolation around Harrison, Vivian, and Chloe. They were completely surrounded by hundreds of people, yet they had never been more utterly alone. They were pariahs. They were a disease that no one wanted to catch. I stood at the podium watching them drown in the reality of their new existence. They had spent their entire lives building a kingdom on lies, arrogance, and cruelty. They had systematically tried to destroy my life to feed their own greed. I had just burned their entire world to the ground in a matter of minutes, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. I stepped away from the microphone, leaving the stage, as the federal agents finally began to drag Harrison toward the exit. The era of the Jackson family was dead, and I had been the one to pull the trigger. Marcus struggled violently against the grip of the federal agents. The panic in his eyes had entirely morphed into a feral, unhinged malice as he realized his life was permanently over. He dug his expensive shoes into the marble floor, refusing to move toward the exit, and twisted his head to glare directly at the stage. "Do you actually think this makes you a winner?" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do you think you will ever be happy after this? You are a cold-blooded monster, Naomi. You are going to be alone forever. No one will ever love a woman this ruthless." I slowly turned my attention away from my sobbing mother and locked eyes with Marcus. The chaotic noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, pathetic energy. I simply smiled. It was a serene expression, my eyes as perfectly still and quiet as a deep, frozen lake. "You once told me that without the protection of this family, I would end up sweeping trash in the slums," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, icy clarity that easily cut through the noise of the crowd. "Well, you were entirely right about one thing, Marcus. I am cleaning up trash today. It is just that this particular pile of garbage happens to be wearing a much more expensive suit." Marcus' face contorted in absolute fury before the agents forcefully shoved him forward, dragging him out of the grand ballroom and into the waiting federal transport vehicles. I turned my gaze back down to the floor. Vivian was still weeping uncontrollably, clutching the torn fabric of her dress. Chloe had collapsed beside her, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, thick lines as she wailed about her ruined life and her seized bank accounts. They were a pathetic portrait of broken entitlement. "Family is supposed to protect each other," I stated, looking down at the 2 women who had spent a lifetime actively trying to destroy my spirit. "You people merely share my DNA." Vivian reached out a trembling hand toward me one final time, her tear-streaked face begging for a salvation that did not exist. I easily stepped out of her reach. "Go ahead and cry," I told them, smoothing the crystal-encrusted skirt of my midnight blue gown. "I have to go count my money." I turned my back on them for the final time. I did not walk fast. I moved with the slow, deliberate stride of a woman who had entirely conquered her world. If a camera had been tracking my exit from a low angle, it would have perfectly captured the sharp, rhythmic striking of my designer heels against the polished marble floor. My posture was unyielding, my silhouette a dark, proud figure cutting through the glittering, opulent light of the venue. Behind me, the desperate, terrified screams of the Jackson family echoed through the cavernous ballroom, but the sound only washed over me like irrelevant background noise. I stepped out of the hall and into the cool, crisp night air. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me with a loud, definitive slam, sealing them inside their self-made prison. The scene fades to absolute black.